"Shut up, Max, for once in your life. Just shut up." The words tore out of me before I could stop them, sharp and raw, bouncing off the narrow houses that lined our street. My voice startled even me. Max froze mid-bark, his head whipping around, amber eyes locking onto mine like I had just betrayed him. For years he had barked at every mailbox on our morning walk, every single one, rain or shine, summer or frost. His deep, rhythmic voice punctuated each post like a metronome of suspicion. But that day was different. We had just turned onto Waverly Lane, the air heavy with that metallic scent before a storm, when he reached the fifth mailbox and stopped. Not just stopped barking, he sat down slowly. His breathing was uneven, nostrils flaring like he'd caught a scent that dug into something deep. He didn't look at me. He stared at the mailbox, a dented, green one with peeling numbers, 118. The rust along its edge looked almost like dried blood. My irritation thinned into unease. "Max, what's wrong?" I muttered, crouching beside him. His ears were pinned back, not in fear, but in that strange, reverent stillness I'd only seen once, the day we found my father's wallet under the shed. Months after he'd passed. The street was quiet, too quiet. Even the usual hum of cars in the distance seemed to have pulled away. Max didn't break his gaze. My fingers itched to yank his leash and move, to erase this moment, but something held me there. Across the street, an elderly man was sweeping his porch. He paused, leaning on his broom, watching us with an expression I couldn't quite read. I glanced at him, then back to Max. "This isn't funny," I whispered, as if he could understand. His tail gave a slow, almost imperceptible wag, not the joyful whip I knew, but something measured, almost sad. Then, without warning, he lay down completely, his chest pressed to the cracked sidewalk. It was so unlike him that I felt a flicker of fear crawl up my spine. I looked at the mailbox again, ordinary dull, except it wasn't. A small strip of masking tape clung to its side, half hidden under the flap, with a single word scrawled in faded marker: "Hope." My mouth went dry. The old man across the street took a step toward us, his broom abandoned on the steps. "That's the Miller place," he said, his voice rough from years of smoke or grief. I couldn't tell. "Ain't nobody lived there for years." Then why I started, but Max's low, mournful whine cut through me. It was a sound I'd only heard when I came home from the hospital, limping and smelling of antiseptic, after the accident that left my brother gone. My chest tightened. The man shrugged, eyes narrowing. "Dog probably smells something. They always know before we do." He turned back toward his house, but his pace was slower now, almost reluctant. I knelt beside Max, brushing my hand along his back. "We're going," I murmured, but when I tugged the leash, he didn't move. His paw lifted, pressing against the base of the mailbox as if marking it, claiming it, or pleading with it. And then I felt it. The air was warmer here, just slightly, but enough to raise the hairs along my arms. A faint, sweet scent drifted up, like lilacs in early spring. There were no flowers anywhere on the street. My mind went back to the winter 3 years ago when Max was just a pup, skittish and half-starved, showing up on my porch in the middle of a snowstorm. He had sat exactly like this then, in front of my door, refusing to leave until I opened it. It wasn't obedience, it was knowing. A car rolled past, the driver's face hidden in shadow. Max finally blinked, breaking his stare. He stood, shook himself once, and without prompting, began to walk again, tail low, glancing back at the mailbox twice before we reached the corner. My steps felt heavier now, each one dragging with questions I didn't want to ask. That night, I dreamt of the mailbox. Only it wasn't dented or green, it was new, gleaming, and in the dream I was opening it. Inside wasn't mail. It was a photograph. A little boy in a red jacket, his arm around a golden retriever that wasn't Max but had the same eyes. Both were smiling in that unguarded, boundless way only children and dogs can. I woke before I could see the boy's face clearly. Max was at the foot of my bed, watching me. His ears pricked at the sound of thunder rolling in the distance. I didn't go back to sleep. The next morning I didn't speak a word as we walked. When we reached Waverly Lane, Max's pace slowed. I braced for barking, for the ritual that had marked every day for years. Instead, he led me straight to 118, sat again, and stared. My breath caught when I noticed something new, a single white envelope tucked under the mailbox flap. There was no stamp, no address, just one word on the front and the same faded marker as the tape: "For you." I didn't reach for it. Not yet, because for the first time in years I wasn't sure who the "you" was supposed to be. The envelope sat there under the flap, the paper slightly curled from the night stamp air. Max didn't take his eyes off it, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm as though he was waiting for permission. My fingers twitched at my side. The rationale part of me wanted to snatch it, tear it open, and get whatever this was over with. But another part, the one that remembered Max's stillness yesterday and the strange warmth in the air, told me to hesitate. It wasn't fear exactly, it was something heavier, a sense that opening it might change the shape of things I didn't even know were fragile. I crouched beside Max, feeling the cool dampness of the sidewalk seep through my jeans. "It's just paper," I whispered, trying to sound like I was talking to him though the words were meant for myself. He gave a slow blink, a soundless answer. My hand closed over the envelope. The paper was softer than it looked, as though it had been handled too many times, passed from one set of hands to another until it became tired. I slid it into my jacket pocket without opening it, the weight of it somehow more than its size. We continued walking, but the usual rhythm of our mornings was broken. Max wasn't scanning each yard or mailbox anymore. His head was low, his stride measured. I found myself glancing over my shoulder, not for danger, but for something unseen that might be following us. At home, I placed the envelope on the kitchen counter. The rain had started, a soft tapping against the windows, and the smell of damp earth drifted in when I cracked the back door to let Max out. He didn't go. He stood there looking at me as if asking why I hadn't opened it yet. I made coffee, though my stomach churned at the thought of drinking it. The envelope stayed where it was, a pale slash against the dark countertop. Finally, unable to bear the silence, I tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of folded paper, the edges frayed. There were only 3 sentences written in shaky but deliberate handwriting. I am sorry. I hope you find what I couldn't give. Look under the porch. My throat tightened. There was no name, no explanation, just that small cluster of words that felt like they had been waiting for me longer than I'd been aware of them. Max was already at the back door when I turned. His paws scraped lightly against the floor as I opened it. We stepped out into the drizzle, the air carrying that same faint sweetness from yesterday. I knelt by the porch, my knees sinking into the wet grass. The boards were warped and darkened from years of weather, but one near the corner looked slightly shifted. I slid my fingers under the edge, splinters catching my skin, and pried it up. Something small and wrapped in a plastic bag lay inside the hollow. My heart thudded. I pulled it out and peeled back the plastic. Inside was a faded photograph, the edges curling. It showed a young girl, maybe 7 or 8, standing in front of a house I didn't recognize. Beside her was a golden retriever, the same dog from my dream. Both were smiling in the sunlight, their shadows stretching long across the grass. The girl's smile was open, bright, but her eyes, they were the same color as mine, the kind of brown that carried flecks of amber if you stood close enough. For a moment, the sound of the rain faded, replaced by the hollow rush of my own breath. I turned the photo over. On the back was written, Summer, 1989. Nothing else. My mind raced, flipping through half-forgotten conversations, the kind my mother used to cut short when I was a child. The pauses that followed questions I didn't know how to press. Max nudged my arm, his nose cold against my skin. He whined, softly, the sound pulling me back to the moment. I slid the photograph back into the plastic, my fingers trembling, and replaced the porch board as best I could. The rain was falling harder now, dripping from my hair into my collar, but I barely felt it back inside. I dried Max off with a towel, though my own clothes were soaked. I stared at the photograph on the table, its colors dulled but still strong enough to pull at something deep in my chest. The handwriting in the note wasn't familiar, but the way the Y curved in sorry tugged at a memory I couldn't quite place. I thought about 118 Waverly Lane and the old man who'd said nobody lived there, about the masking tape with hope written on it, about Max's sudden, unshakable need to stop there after years of barking his way down that street. The pieces didn't fit yet, but they were starting to take shape, like the edges of a puzzle you don't realize you've been assembling. That night I left the photograph and the note on my bedside table. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that little girl's smile and those eyes that mirrored mine. By 2 in the morning, I was sitting on the couch, Max's head in my lap, tracing the lines of her face in my mind. Whatever this was, it wasn't over, and I knew, with the same certainty Max had when he sat at that mailbox, that the next step would take me back to 118, not for the mailbox, not even for the house, for the truth that had been sitting there all along, waiting for me to finally stop walking and see it. Max didn't want to leave the house that morning. Normally, the sound of his leash being unclipped from its hook was enough to have him bounding toward the door, nails clicking against the hardwood, but that day he lingered. In the hallway, ears twitching at sounds I couldn't hear. I called to him twice before he emerged, slow and deliberate, his amber eyes fixed on mine like he was weighing whether I was ready for whatever lay ahead. The envelope from the day before still sat on my kitchen counter, untouched. I had told myself I would open it last night, but something in the way Max watched me like he'd been guarding something made me wait. I hadn't even dared move it. We stepped out into the cold, the street bathed in the pale light of early morning. The air carried that post-storm freshness, damp earth and asphalt still holding the night's rain. Max's pace was steady, but his head turned toward each mailbox we passed as if taking mental note. When we reached Waverly Lane, I felt his body tighten on the leash, his gait slowing. He didn't bark. He didn't even sniff around. He simply stopped in front of 118 and stared again, his breath puffing in small clouds. The envelope was gone. A tightness gripped my chest. "Did you take me here to show me something?" I asked, knowing the question was absurd but unable to help it. Max's gaze didn't shift. I walked closer to the mailbox, my hand brushing over the metal. cold, wet from the rain, but otherwise unchanged. Then I saw its scratches near the base, faint but deliberate, as if someone had been trying to pry it open. My stomach turned. Sound behind me made me spin. The old man from across the street was there again, leaning against his porch rail. His voice carried over the quiet. "They used to get letters like that all the time," he said, "before it happened." "What happened?" My voice was sharper than I meant, a mix of nerves and something else I couldn't name. He shook his head slowly. "Not my story to tell. But if your dog's fixated, maybe it's already yours." I wanted to ask more, but Max suddenly whined, low and urgent, pulling me toward the side of the house. We reached the edge of the yard, and there, half buried in wet leaves, was another envelope. This one was bent, waterlogged at the edges, but still sealed. My name was on the front. Not my full name, just Sarah, handwritten in the same faded marker. I crouched, my fingers trembling as I picked it up. It felt heavier than it should have, like it was holding more than paper. Max pressed his nose to it, breathing in deep, then looked at me with a mix of expectation and warning. I slipped it into my coat pocket, deciding not to open it here. Some part of me didn't want the street to witness whatever was inside. We walked home in silence. My thoughts churned, replaying every moment since yesterday. Why here? Why now? Max had barked at mailboxes for years without a break in the pattern. Why did he stop? And who was leaving these messages? Back inside, I set the envelope on the table next to the first one. The contrast was unsettling, one dry and pristine, the other damp and bruised by the weather. I stared at them for a long moment before finally breaking the seal on the wet one. Inside was a folded photograph, the edges curled and softened by time. That was the boy from my dream, the same red jacket, the same golden retriever, only now the image was real. The boy's face was clearer, messy brown hair, wide grin, but there was something in his eyes, something almost haunting. And the dog's eyes were Max's. Not similar, not close. The same dot. My throat tightened as I looked from the photo to Max, who was sitting across the room watching me with that same unreadable stillness. A rush of cold spread through me as I realized he wasn't just guarding me. He was guarding a story that had started long before I came into it. The first envelope still lay unopened, its neat folds suddenly feeling heavier than the photograph in my hand. I reached for it, my pulse drumming in my ears. Max stood, stepping closer, his nails clicking softly on the floor. He didn't look at the envelope, he looked at me, and in that silent exchange, I knew whatever was inside wasn't going to just answer questions. It was going to change something. I slid my thumb under the flap, the paper's tear sounding impossibly loud in the stillness of the kitchen. But before I could unfold it, Max let out a deep, resonant bark that echoed through the house, a sound that felt less like warning and more like a signal. My head snapped toward the window. Someone was standing at the end of my driveway, half hidden in the shadow of the maple tree, and they were watching us. The rain had started as a soft mist, but by the time we reached the corner of Waverly Lane, it had become a cold, steady drizzle that blurred the edges of the houses and turned the pavement into a slick ribbon. Max's fur was damp, his tail hanging low, but his eyes burned with the same fixed intensity they had every time we came near 118. I'd avoided the street for days, telling myself it was because of the weather or my schedule, but I knew the truth. I didn't want to face that mailbox again. Not after the envelope, not after what I'd found inside. The letter had been written in a hand that trembled even on paper. The words were few, but each one felt heavy enough to pin me to the floor. He was my boy. Tell me if you've seen him. I know the dog remembers. No name, no number, no date, just a plea, and the faintest smear of something brown in the corner that I couldn't bring myself to analyze. I had hidden it in the kitchen drawer under a stack of old bills. But it was all I'd been thinking about since. Max slowed his pace as we approached 118 again. The rain made his eyes glisten, but there was something else there, that same quiet pull that had started all of this. My chest tightened. "Max," I said softly, almost hoping he wouldn't hear me over the rain. But he glanced back as if to make sure I was still following. He reached the mailbox and sat without hesitation. This time there was no envelope, no tape, just the deep green metal, dented and cold. But the street wasn't empty. Across the road, a woman stood under a black umbrella. She was watching us, her face hidden by the shadow of the canopy, but I could feel her gaze pressing into me. Max noticed her too. He didn't bark, he just stared. My stomach knotted. Something about the way she stood, perfectly still in the rain, was wrong. I almost called out to her, but she turned and began walking away, slow and deliberate, her figure fading into the curtain of rain. "Wait." The word slipped out before I could stop it, but she didn't turn. Max's body shifted forward, as if he wanted to follow, but I kept my grip on the leash. Every instinct told me to let her go. Yet another part, the part that had been restless since the letter, screamed not to. My pulse pounded in my ears. I made a choice. We crossed the street, my boots splashing in shallow puddles, and followed the direction she'd gone. The houses grew older, more run down, windows fogged with condensation, porches cluttered with years of neglect. Max kept his head low, sniffing the wet air, his movements deliberate. Then, halfway down the block, he stopped again. This time it wasn't a mailbox, it was a gate, old and leaning, its paint long gone. The number on the post was so faded it was almost invisible. Through the bars, I could see a yard choked with weeds, and beyond that, the shadowy outline of a house that looked abandoned. But there was movement in the window, a flicker, as if someone had just stepped out of sight. My breath clouded in the cold air. Max gave a low whine, pawing at the gate. I reached down, my fingers curling around the rusted latch, and for a second I thought about pushing it open. But then I heard a door creaking inside the house, followed by the faintest sound of a child's laugh. It didn't make sense. There were no kids on this street. Not anymore. I stepped back, heart racing, torn between the urge to run and the need to know. Max pressed closer to the gate, his fur bristling along his spine. I looked at him, and in his eyes I saw something that chilled me more than the rain. Not fear, not aggression, but recognition. He knew this place. He knew that laugh. The woman with the umbrella was gone now, but her absence felt heavier than her presence had. Somewhere deep inside me, I understood that this was no coincidence. Max hadn't been barking at every mailbox for years because of some meaningless habit. He had been searching, waiting, and now at last he had found what he was looking for. But as I stood there in the rain, my hand still on the latch, I realized something else. Whatever was behind that gate, whoever was in that house might not be ready to be found, and maybe, just maybe, neither was I. The rain had eased into a fine mist by the time I unlatched the gate. The hinges groaned in protest loud enough to make my chest tighten, but I pushed it open anyway. Max slipped through first, moving with a strange mix of urgency and care, as if he didn't want to scare away whatever waited inside. The yard was soft under my boots, the earth soaked and giving, weeds brushing against my legs as we made our way to the porch. I could feel eyes on us, though no one stood in the window now. The front door was ajar, the faint scent of damp wood and something sweeter lilacs again drifting out. My throat tightened. I stepped inside, Max at my heel. The house was dim, shadows clinging to the corners, but in the middle of the living room stood a boy. He couldn't have been more than 8, his hair damp, his bare feet leaving prints on the dusty floorboards. He didn't flinch at the sight of me, only looked at Max with wide, unblinking eyes. Max froze, then took a slow step forward. The boy's lips trembled, and in a voice barely louder than a breath, he said, "Charlie." The name was unfamiliar to me, but Max's reaction was instant. His tail gave a single hesitant wag, and then he closed the distance, pressing his head against the boy's chest. The boy crumpled to his knees, wrapping thin arms around Max's neck, burying his face in the wet fur. I stood there, rooted, feeling like I'd stepped into a moment that wasn't mine to interrupt. A sound came from the hallway, the uneven shuffle of footsteps. The woman with the black umbrella appeared, her hair streaked with gray, her eyes lined with years of loss. She didn't look at me at first. Her gaze was fixed on the boy, her mouth trembling as though holding back a flood of words. Finally, her eyes found mine, and in them was an unspoken plea, one I understood without needing it explained. "This is your dog?" I asked quietly. She shook her head. "He was my son's. He never came home." Her voice broke on the last word. The boy lifted his head, still holding Max. "He came back," he whispered, as if those 3 words were all the proof he needed that hope was real. I didn't ask how Max had known, or why he had led me here after all these years of barking at empty mailboxes. Some things aren't meant to be reasoned with, they're meant to be carried, like a quiet truth you keep close. When we left, the rain had stopped. The street felt different now, lighter somehow, as if something long overdue had finally found its way home. Max didn't bark once on the walk back. He didn't need to, and though I still didn't know what it was he had been searching for all this time, I realized that maybe it wasn't just his search that had ended. Maybe it was mine, too.